If you believe that no one should be judged by their uniform, hit that like button and subscribe because this story is going to make you think twice. Tell us where you're watching from too. We'd love to hear how far this story is reaching. It was a quiet day at the courthouse. Samantha Turner, a 29-year-old janitor, moved between the hallways with the deliberate grace of someone who had been doing this job for years. She swept the floors, cleaned the windows, and wiped down the counters like clockwork. To the average observer, she was just another face, just another worker, one of the countless people who went unseen in the background of government buildings. But no one could have known that behind her simple janitor uniform and the humble smile she wore daily was a history that could shatter the image they all had of her. She had been there for 2 years, long enough to become part of the building's rhythm, part of the noise that everyone ignored. Samantha didn't mind. She didn't need their recognition. She wasn't here to show off. She was here because after years of service in Afghanistan, after saving countless lives on missions no one would ever write about, she had chosen this quiet path. But no one knew that yet. Not even the officers, the lawyers, or the judge, a man who treated everyone like dirt, convinced his own self-worth was the only thing that mattered. Judge Nathaniel Foster was everything Samantha had left behind in the military, arrogant, loud, and dismissive of anyone he deemed beneath him. When he saw Samantha cleaning the halls, he never bothered to look twice, but he made sure to laugh and mock the lowly janitors whenever they crossed his path. To him, she was no more than the woman who emptied the trash and scrubbed the floors. He never realized the woman who served him every day had been through more in her 29 years than he could ever imagine. And that day? That was when Samantha decided she had had enough. The day started just like any other, with a floor to sweep and a window to clean. But when she passed the judge's chambers, Foster caught sight of her and snickered to a few of the other officers nearby. What's she gonna do? Wash the courthouse floor with her medals, he sneered, his voice carrying down the hallway. The officers around him laughed, their voices echoing off the marble floors. Samantha didn't stop to argue. She didn't look back. She wasn't bothered by his words. But in that moment, something inside her changed. She wasn't angry. She was just tired. Tired of being overlooked. Tired of being dismissed. Later that afternoon, in front of the officers and courthouse staff, Foster called her out, his voice dripping with sarcasm. He saw her again, just as she was wiping down the railing near the main hallway. He marched up to her with a smirk, standing tall as if he had something important to say. "So, what's it like to live a life of service and then end up here?" he asked, his words cruel, as if the janitor's role was some kind of failure. He looked at the young woman, judging her, assuming the worst. "You wear your medals like a badge of honor. Why not hand them over?" He laughed, turning to his fellow officers as if he were telling some joke they all should laugh at. Samantha's eyes narrowed, but she said nothing. She didn't need to argue with him. Instead, she slowly reached up and pulled at the collar of her janitor's shirt. A glint of silver flashed underneath the fabric, and she revealed the silver star pinned to her chest, just beneath the hem of her shirt. The room went silent. The officer stopped laughing. Judge Foster's smug grin faltered as he stared at the medal, his eyes flickering with disbelief. "What's this?" he asked, his voice suddenly unsure. "It's a silver star, awarded for gallantry in action," she replied calmly, her voice steady but firm. She didn't need to say anything else. The judge blinked, speechless, his eyes moving from the medal back to her face, then back to the medal again. But Samantha didn't stop there. She stood tall, lifting her head and meeting his gaze with an unflinching calm. "You wanted me to hand them over?" she said softly, her words cutting through the room. "You don't get to mock someone for the service they've given, not when you don't even know what it means to serve." The officers around her stood frozen, their laughter gone. The judge, too proud and too arrogant to admit he had made a fool of himself, tried to regain his composure. But the room had already shifted. Foster opened his mouth, but nothing came out. There was nothing he could say, and in that silence, Samantha didn't need to speak again. As the room began to settle, a quiet murmur spread between the officers. Some glanced at her, as if seeing her for the first time. A few of them stepped back, unsure what to make of the young woman standing before them. Foster, still reeling from the shock, straightened up and tried to play it off as a mistake, but the damage had been done. Samantha didn't let him off the hook. The next few moments unfolded quickly, as if the universe itself had decided that the judge's time was up. She quietly pulled out her phone and dialed a number. It was a direct line she had kept for emergencies. A few seconds later, the door to the courtroom swung open, and in walked Colonel Lisa Brooks, a senior military officer with decades of service. As soon as she entered, her presence commanded the room. The officer stood a little straighter. Even Judge Foster, with his usual arrogance, seemed to deflate under her gaze. Colonel Brooks didn't speak right away. She didn't have to. She walked straight up to Samantha, her hand outstretched in a silent salute, and Samantha shook her hand, her posture unwavering. "Judge Foster," Colonel Brooks finally said, turning to face him, her voice cold. "I think you've forgotten who you're dealing with." Foster's face flushed red, and for the first time that day, he was at a loss for words. The colonel continued, but her words were not just for Foster. They were for everyone in the room, a reminder that dignity is earned through actions, not titles or uniforms. As the colonel spoke, Samantha stood there, her hands steady by her sides, watching the judge's career unravel in front of her eyes. She wasn't interested in revenge. She wasn't interested in proving anything to anyone. But when a system fails to see you for who you truly are, sometimes it takes one moment of quiet strength to show them the truth. And in that moment, the judge understood something that no one in that room could have ever imagined. The janitor was more than just a janitor. The courtroom fell into a heavy silence. Samantha Turner didn't flinch. She didn't speak again. She simply stood there, her gaze unwavering, as the stunned room absorbed the shock of what had just unfolded. The silver star she wore, once a symbol of pride and sacrifice, was now the very thing that cut through the judge's veneer of power, exposing the hollowness of his assumptions. Judge Foster stood frozen, staring at the metal as though he had just seen a ghost. His mind raced, trying to piece together what was happening. Samantha wasn't just the janitor. She wasn't just the woman who cleaned his courtrooms, emptied his trash, and wiped down his desks. No, she was someone far more significant, someone with a history he could never imagine. And in that moment, with the eyes of the courtroom on her, he realized the gravity of his words. But Samantha didn't give him the satisfaction of a reaction. She remained composed, her face impassive, her body still, as if the words he had thrown at her didn't even exist. Colonel Lisa Brooks, the high-ranking military officer who had entered the room with such presence, stepped forward. There was no fanfare, no dramatic speech. She simply walked toward Samantha and extended her hand. Samantha, with a calm that defied the situation, took it. It wasn't a handshake filled with apologies or sympathy. It was a gesture of respect. Colonel Brooks, though a decorated officer herself, had seen enough in Samantha's posture and demeanor to recognize her strength. She didn't need to ask questions. She knew who this woman was. She had seen her type before. The ones who didn't boast, didn't need recognition. The ones who did their duty and did it well, without looking for credit. The ones who left their mark without making a sound. With the judge still stunned, Colonel Brooks turned to him, her eyes icy with authority. "Judge Foster," she began, her voice clear and unwavering. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." The judge opened his mouth to speak, but quickly closed it again, as if his words had evaporated. He had no defense. He had no excuse. The eyes of the room were now on him, watching him as if they were seeing him for the first time. Samantha, still quiet, still standing with the colonel, had become something he never expected, a symbol of everything he had dismissed and belittled. Colonel Brooks continued, her words directed at the room, but more importantly at Foster. "This woman," she said, nodding toward Samantha, "is a hero, a true hero, and her actions in Afghanistan are what led to her earning that silver star. The same silver star that you thought was something to mock, something to belittle." Foster's face turned red, and for a moment, his chest puffed out with the arrogance he usually wore like armor. But it wasn't working anymore. The room had shifted. The officers who had laughed at Samantha earlier now exchanged uneasy glances. The staff who had once dismissed her as just another cleaning lady now looked at her with a mix of confusion and awe. There was no room for pride or bravado in this moment. The truth had come out. Samantha didn't speak. She didn't need to. Colonel Brooks did all the talking. She didn't raise her voice or scream for justice. She simply stated the facts, and those facts were undeniable. And the more Samantha stood there, silent and resolute, the more it became clear to everyone in the room. They had underestimated her, misjudged her, and now they would have to live with the consequences of that mistake. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of silence, Colonel Brooks turned back to Foster, who was still struggling to regain his composure. She didn't ask for an apology, didn't demand an explanation. Instead, her next words were sharp and simple. "The military will be filing a formal complaint with the Judicial Review Board," she said. "Your actions today were unacceptable. This will not go unnoticed." The judge opened his mouth, but the words were lost in the heavy air. He couldn't defend himself. Samantha's silence had already spoken louder than anything he could say. The room was still, and for the first time in a long time, Judge Foster felt small. He wasn't the authority he thought he was. He wasn't the one in control, and he knew it. Samantha didn't smile. She didn't do anything to gloat or take pleasure in the judge's discomfort. She simply stood tall, knowing that she had done what needed to be done. And with that quiet dignity, she had not only shut down Foster's cruelty, but she had opened the eyes of everyone around her. They no longer saw the janitor. They saw a woman who had given more than they could ever imagine. As the colonel turned to leave, her heels clicking against the cold marble floor, the room followed her out, the heavy weight of the moment lingering long after they were gone. Samantha stood alone in the quiet of the courtroom, her medal still visible, the weight of it now symbolizing something more than just military valor. It symbolized resilience. It symbolized the power of silence. It symbolized the strength that comes from being underestimated and then proving everyone wrong. And Judge Foster? Well, his career had just taken its first, irreparable blow. The damage had been done. There was no coming back from this. And deep down, he knew it. The day after the courtroom incident, the courthouse was buzzing with whispers. The staff, once quick to dismiss Samantha Turner as nothing more than a janitor, now eyed her with a mix of curiosity and unease. The judges, the officers, even the cleaning crew, they had all seen her as something beneath them. But now they couldn't look at her the same way again. Judge Foster was nowhere to be seen. Rumor had it he had been called in for an emergency meeting with the Judicial Review Board, his suspension effective immediately. That much was clear. The fallout from his public humiliation was swift and unforgiving. But Samantha? She continued her work as if nothing had changed. She didn't demand a crowd. She didn't seek recognition. She simply cleaned, just as she had always done. But the world had shifted. Those who had once looked down on her now respected her, not because of her silver star or her military service, but because of the quiet power she carried. Colonel Lisa Brooks had made sure of that, and her presence alone had sealed the judge's fate. As for Samantha, she remained humble, staying true to the path she had chosen. Despite the whispers of admiration that followed her through the courthouse, she didn't let the attention change her. She was not here for accolades, for applause, or for anyone's approval. She was here because, after everything she had done for this country, this was where she had decided to be. She was here to serve, in a way that mattered to her, regardless of what anyone else saw. But the real change happened not because of what Samantha had done, but because of how the people around her had seen her, how their perceptions had shattered in an instant. That morning, a few days after the confrontation with Judge Foster, a young officer from the courthouse, Officer Greg Miller, approached her as she was cleaning the back hallway. He had been one of the men who had laughed when Foster made his cruel comments. But now, he stopped in front of her, hesitating for a moment, before holding out his hand. "Samantha," he said, his voice uncharacteristically soft, "I owe you an apology. What you did, it was something I didn't expect. You have more courage than I gave you credit for." She looked at him, her face unreadable, then slowly extended her hand, shaking his firmly. "No apology necessary," she said. "Just do your job right. That's all I ask." And with that, she turned and walked away, her quiet dignity settling back over her like a second skin. She didn't need him to apologize. She didn't need anything from anyone. She had proven her worth in a way no one could ever deny again. By the end of the week, Judge Foster's career had ended. He had been dismissed from his position and would likely never return to the bench again. The whispers about his downfall spread far and wide, his arrogance and ignorance exposed for all to see. Samantha, though, was already moving on. For her, this was just one more chapter in a long, complicated life of service. The battle wasn't over. It had never been about a single judge, a single moment. It had been about something far deeper. The simple truth that respect, earned in silence, speaks louder than anything anyone could ever say. But the story wasn't over yet. 2 weeks later, a package arrived for Samantha at the courthouse. She didn't know who had sent it, but she had a feeling. She unwrapped it slowly, revealing a box, the kind that might hold something significant, something valuable. Inside, she found a framed photo of herself in full military gear, standing tall with a group of soldiers. The photo had been taken years ago, before everything had changed. Beneath the glass frame was a handwritten note, scrawled in familiar handwriting. "Your service isn't over, Samantha. You've earned more than you realize. I'll be seeing you soon. Colonel Brooks." Samantha smiled faintly as she read the note. It wasn't an invitation to fame. It wasn't a call to come back and take a higher position. No, it was simply a reminder. Her story wasn't finished. The next chapter was hers to write. Samantha Turner never asked for recognition. But that silver star? It had been earned with every breath she had taken on the battlefield and every quiet moment of sacrifice that followed. Now, it wasn't just her past that defined her. It was the way she had stood up when others tried to tear her down, the way she had handled every challenge with grace, dignity, and patience. And those were the qualities that would carry her forward, no matter where she went next. As for the courthouse, they would never see her the same way again.